Hi, this is a follow-up video to the testimony that I gave Laura Maxwell detailing my spiritual journey. If you are unfamiliar with that story, I'm going to leave a link to it below this video. I encourage you to check that out first before listening to what I'm about to say, because you'll get all the background that makes what I'm about to say much more sense. If you just listen to this, probably there'll be stuff missing. I would think. So anyway, I had such a response after giving my testimony to Laura that I've begun writing blog posts for her, and I wanted to just start doing follow-up videos to add to my YouTube channel as well on these subjects. So diving in, what I want to talk about today is the difference in lifestyle between being a New Ager and a Christian. It has really surprised me. I've had a lot of insight regarding this recently, and it's not what I would have thought in the past. You know, being raised in a religious home, as I got closer and closer to being a teenager, I began to see Christianity as boring and dull and just following a bunch of rules and going to church and hanging out with all these people that were just basically, hypocritical. I did not see this victorious life in Christ that I was supposed to be seeing. I couldn't wait to get out of there. When I graduated from my elementary school, I had it in my head that I was going to go party, and boy, did I. So I spent the next 10 years of my life kind of a dark place. I began to be in severe bondage, alcoholism and drug addiction, and I was with a man that was horrible for 10 years. So about 5 years into it, I really wanted out, but I didn't have really a lifeline to grab onto, so I didn't know where to go. So I just kind of made the best of it. And after another 5 years, I was so sick of my life, and that's when I got introduced to New Age. And I basically got pulled out of the life I was in by a Reiki healing. And it was interesting because those first few months of freedom were the most amazing time. It was incredible tasting the freedom. I had a high, basically. I was on this high, and I was free of all my addictions and free of the bondage of the man I'd been living with. I'd gotten out on my own, and it was incredible to experience these things for the first time. So I became almost a junkie for this feeling. I built a copper pyramid in my house to meditate in, and I went crazy with crystals. I had them hanging all over my house, and I used to wear so many crystals in this clump around my neck that my fellow crystal people would make fun of me. I made all these different tools with crystals. I made this thing called a chakra stick that would hang over your bed and heal you while you're sleeping, you know, all these different things. And I became a Reiki master, started learning shamanism, and I studied how to be a medium. And I used to go to the spiritualist center called Chesterfield as often as I possibly could. I would go to New Age festivals and just do as much as I possibly could and learn as much as I could. It all seemed so much of like a high vibration to me. Like I was used to heavy metal and a dirty house and a mean boyfriend and just all these like low vibe things. And this was all way up there, you know. It was such a feeling that I couldn't believe it. I just dove further and further and further in and absorbed as much as I possibly could. It completely consumed me. And it was interesting because the further time went on, I started feeling heavy again. And the more I would read and the more I would talk to people, I would just keep seeing that I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't meditating enough. I wasn't doing this enough or that enough, or I needed to cleanse more and all these things. And as time went on, it really became a burden to basically evolve my own soul and to be in charge of all these things. I began to feel like I needed so much protection. I had all these crystals for protection, and there were all these spells and things I had to do, and I was constantly doing divination, trying to figure out where I needed to go and what my path was and all these different things. And as time went on, I just really began to feel just such a burden, and it just became another form of bondage to me. I'm going to refer to my notes here for a second, make sure I stay on track. I'm looking at the blog post that I wrote, Laura. I began to feel like I was seeing a lot of red flags with my new life. Like I had been having an affair with my Reiki master, which is part of what gave me the courage to leave the man that I had been with. And we were going to, run away and have this New Age center in Canada and blah, blah, blah. Well, obviously, he never came, but that's a good thing. Obviously wasn't meant to be. So, that was one. That was a big one for me. And the further I dove into the law of attraction teachings, the more that I began to see that it isn't as enlightened as it claims to be. Things like you got to avoid people on the street that need help because you might catch their negativity, and you don't want to interfere with their life lessons. They purposely came here to do these things, and you're going to interfere with what they're supposed to be learning in this time around on reincarnation if you help them. And I was just like, none of this sounds right, there were things like that. And so I was really struggling after a couple years into it of wondering where that feeling was, the freedom that I had felt when I first started out. I had felt light as a feather, and I just began to feel heavier and heavier and more burdened with the work of evolving my own soul and being in charge of all these things every day that just seemed like an awful lot of work, and when my cat Quizzy died, I was so devastated. He was my sweetest little boy, and he died at 2 years old. Kidney failure was a total shock, and he was just a little baby, and I thought it was going to kill me. I was like, I went on this vendetta. I was going to go find his soul on the other side and work it out with him for his reincarnation so that he could come back to me in the form of a new cat. And it was completely consuming to me. I used to do shamanic journeys every single day to go talk to Quizzy and work it all out. And I ended up supposedly finding his reincarnated self a couple months later. And it was such a hard time for me. It was such a struggle, and I felt like it was all up to me. It was all me. I had to do these things. And I imagine a lot of things that actually needed done sat by the wayside while I journeyed off to visit my cat's soul, So that's just one example of great amount of work that the life I had taken on required, the day started with divination and ended with divination, and there's meditation and burning sage and wearing the crystals and doing the flower essences and all these different things. The list goes on and on and on and on. And it was just so much work. So when I had my encounter with Jesus, that was 7 years ago. In 2010, all these things I surrendered to him. I just gave it all up. I knew the moment I encountered him that he was truth and he was the way, he's life. And all these things was just burdens I was carrying around. So I handed it all to him, and he just took it. And you want to talk about freedom from bondage. Unbelievable. absolutely unbelievable. The difference is incredible. You know, people that are not Christians will refer to this as slavery and rules and religion, and that's not it at all. That's not it at all. The best analogy that I could think of is, imagine a homeless child on the street, and it's up to them to provide their own meals and to try and find shelter for the day, and all these things that a young child is not supposed to be doing. And then imagine that a benevolent person steps in and says, I'm going to take care of you. And out of love in their heart, they take that child in and they take care of that child. And that child is free to just be a child because they have an adoptive parent taking care of them now. And they don't have to worry about scraping up that meal because the loving parent has food on the table for them. That is the best analogy I can think of when comparing this whole New Age thing to Christianity, because I just trust him and he leads me now. I mean, how easy is that? And I can trust him because he's good and he does lead and he's real, and it's not just following a religion and a list of rules. I mean, you're talking about a real person that is God and his spirit coming to live inside. I mean, I used to mess around with spirits in New Age. I had spirit guides, and that was nothing like this. I'll tell you what. It's a sham and a shadow and a farce compared to what I've experienced with the Lord. After we became Christians, a few years into it, well, let's see, more like 5 years into it, uh-oh, baby's awake. We'll have to pause this. It was actually back in 2014. We had a son that died shortly after birth, and it was a shock. No one was expecting it. It was a rare defect that didn't get caught on the pre-birth checks. It was fascinating because it was like the Lord took my hand and said, okay, we're going to go through something really hard right now, but I'm here and I'm going to help you through it, because that's exactly how it happened. Unlike my cat, where I carried the sole burden of the whole thing. The first thing that happened was he passed away and we went home without a baby, and I was kind of in shock. And then for the next 4 days, we were preparing for his funeral. We had to go through all the arrangements, and I cannot tell you the amount of love that we received from people around us. People came out of the woodwork from everywhere, dropping off gifts at our door and sending well wishes, and it was incredible. But throughout all that, I had people showing up at my door that had just wounds pouring out of them. It was like I became a counselor for almost a week. All these people would come to my door and want to talk about something that was really hurting them, and I helped them talk through it, and it was really interesting. And then the day of the funeral came, and I prayed out loud on the way to that funeral. I didn't even know I was going to pray this. I just said, Lord, I can't do this. I need you to come just take over my body and do it for me. And you know, it's like that's what he did. When we got to the funeral home, they grabbed me and took me aside and said, we have a problem. I'm like, now what? And apparently he had been too large for the free casket, which didn't open, by the way. It was sealed with glue, so I wasn't going to be able to see him. And they're like, well, the one we had to upgrade you actually opens, so you can see him. So I went right over to the casket and opened it up, and he was so beautiful. He was so beautiful, and he had looked horrible in the hospital, you know. And I saw like what he really would have looked like, and he was just amazing. And it made me happy to see him that way. And right after that, my aunt showed up. She was mentally ill, and she was approaching the casket, and she's like freaking out. I'm like, oh no. So I ran up to her, and I started rubbing her back and telling her it was okay. Look how beautiful he is, and he's with the Lord now, and it's okay. And that was like the mode that I got in. Like, I just found myself doing that with everyone because it was true. He was beautiful, and he's with the Lord, and it's okay. And so I was telling everyone that, and there were hundreds of people that came through there that day, and I just basically was saying the same thing over and over to all these people. And it was fascinating because we actually ended up getting derailed off of the spiritual path that we were on at that time. We were becoming Anglican. We were actually heading dangerously close to Catholicism. And I didn't know at the time the difference between these things and evangelicalism, Reformed Church, Protestantism. I thought it was all basically the same thing and just different denominations. I didn't realize the stark differences. So it was fascinating how the Lord used the death of my son to put my husband and I on a completely different path. And if my son wouldn't have died, that wouldn't have happened. It was through a very unique set of circumstances that directly resulted from the death of my son. It was actually the person that my husband was training under to become an Anglican priest took my husband aside and chastised him for us being too happy at my son's funeral, and it was very odd, especially in hindsight, because I clearly saw it as a work of the Lord. I did not premeditate that I was going to be a certain way, that I was going to do anything. I was just blindly heading into a funeral for my baby. So that really just kind of severed the relationship, and things went from there. And it was interesting looking back at how the Lord just kind of led us through the whole thing. And with Quizzy, my cat, I took this humongous burden upon myself to go find his soul and make sure I hooked back up with him. And it was this real frantic chase, and it was this huge thing that, I had to do. And now, when my son died, it wasn't like that at all. It hurt. Of course it hurt. I was a mother, and I lost my baby. But I can trust that he's okay, and that I'm going to see him again, and he's never going to feel pain or the sting of sin and all these things. And his death was a result of the fallen world that we live in. It's an unfortunate side effect, but the new world that's coming isn't going to have that, and we can look forward to that as Christians. And comparing the death of my cat and the death of my son seems crazy when you say, I'm going to compare the death of my cat and the death of my son. People are like, you must be nuts. When I can say that it was harder for me to go through the death of my cat in some ways. I was so traumatized, and it was all up to me. But it wasn't like that with my son. It's like the Lord gave me everything I needed to get through the hardest thing that he was ever going to lead me through. He gave me everything. He gave me all these people to help me through, and all these different sets of circumstances that just helped lift me up and carried me through the whole thing. And years later, it still hurts. It's always going to hurt. I lost my son, but there are plenty of things I can take comfort in through it, and I can still trust that God is good. He carried me through that. And my husband and I are in a much better place now because of the derailment that we had for where we were heading. Looking back where we were heading, it was not good. We were starting to get into mysticism and all these different things that were just heading right back into New Age and ritual and all these things that weren't leading us closer to Jesus. They were leading us away from him. So he put us back on the path that we needed to be on, and it's okay. So these are just a couple of the things that you can compare New Age and following Jesus, and there's no question the difference between bondage and freedom. I mean, trying to take everything upon yourself is impossible. Not to mention daunting and a very heavy weight and pretty depressing. I mean, I can't think of anything more freeing than to have a loving adoptive parent lead me through things rather than it being up to me to just kind of blindly grope my way through this sin-sick, horrible place sometimes. But now I can see the beauty and not focus on all the burden. Not that there isn't burden, because there is. But that's another conversation. So I just wanted to kind of touch on the whole thing of the bondage and the burden of trying to evolve your own soul and to be in charge of everything around you in such a way that it's not possible. So of course it's depressing. And the freedom that comes from simply following Jesus, because he's good and he is truth, and you just have to follow him. And yeah, there's hard spots that he leads you through. You know, like I said, that adoptive parent. So anyway, well, that's it. I'm about to try my hand at video editing software and try and morph these clips together and maybe stick some things in between. So thanks for listening. You know, I'm just a person talking about my story. So there you have it. And I'm going to do some videos continuing on talking about some different things. I'd like to talk about all the different parts of the church that I've experienced since becoming a Christian. I've kind of gone through the gambit, so I have some interesting stories there. And if there's anything specific that you guys want to hear about regarding my journey, just drop it in the comments, and I'll see if I can talk about it. So anyway, thanks for listening. Talk to you later.